It wasn't a headline that set this off. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't a dramatic interview clip going viral. According to people close to Peter Criss, it started the way the most personal stories usually start, with a phone call. Not from a reporter, not from a fan, but from someone who sounded like they weren't supposed to be saying what they were saying. Peter has always been careful about how he speaks publicly. Even when he's frustrated, even when he's emotional, he tends to frame things as his perspective, as what he felt, what he experienced, what he believes. And that's important here, because what follows is not a proven allegation, and it's not presented as a confirmed factual event. It's presented as what Peter reportedly believes happened, and why it hit him like a punch to the chest. Because the object at the center of the story isn't just an object. It's Ace's vault. And when people hear that word, vault, they imagine something cinematic, something dramatic, something criminal. But in the world of legacy artists, a vault is often something much simpler and much more sacred. A personal archive, boxes of unreleased demos, handwritten notes, old studio tapes, setlist drafts, personal memorabilia, private recordings that were never meant for public consumption. To an outsider, it's just old material. To the person who lived it, it's identity. And according to those familiar with how Ace Frehley treats his work, Ace's personal archive has always been protective territory. Not because he's paranoid, because that era of rock history is valuable, and once personal archives become assets, people start treating them like property instead of memory. Which is why the alleged information Peter received shook him. Because it wasn't about a song being leaked. It wasn't about a rumor. It was about access. Peter reportedly heard that Ace's vault, his personal archive, had been opened without Ace's permission. Again, we have to be clear. This is framed as a report and a perception, not a verified claim with documentation. But what matters is how Peter says it felt. Because when Peter heard that, he didn't react like someone hearing gossip. He reacted like someone hearing that a boundary had been crossed. Sources close to Peter claim the first thing he asked wasn't, "What did they take?" It was, "Who opened it?" That's a different kind of question. That's not curiosity. That's fear. Because in Peter's mind, according to people close to him, the vault wasn't just private storage. It represented trust. It represented Ace's control over his own creative history. And if someone could access that without permission, Peter reportedly believed it meant the rules had changed. Quietly, without anyone announcing it. And if the rules had changed there, Peter's mind went to the next uncomfortable thought. If they can touch Ace's history, they can shape Ace's legacy. Peter has been around this world long enough to know how legacy gets rewritten. It doesn't happen with obvious edits. It happens with selective releases, with official documentaries, with approved narratives, with the way stories are told in public and then repeated until they feel like facts. Archives are powerful because they contain raw history, the unpolished version, the version before branding. So if someone gets control of that raw material, they don't just gain access to songs. They gain access to story. According to sources, Peter went quiet after the call. Not because he didn't care, because he cared too much. People close to him claim he paced, replayed the details, asked questions that sounded more like someone trying to verify a nightmare than someone chasing drama. And then he reportedly said something that, to those who heard it, felt like a line being crossed. A line that wasn't about business or paperwork. A line about loyalty. Peter reportedly said, "That's when I knew." He didn't say, "That's when I suspected." He didn't say, "That's when I started wondering." He said it like a conclusion, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. And if you're wondering what "I knew" means, that's the core of this story. Because Peter's next words, according to those close to him, weren't aimed at the public. They were aimed at the reality behind the scenes. That certain people were no longer respecting boundaries. That certain decisions were no longer being made with trust. That the old friendships, the ones fans romanticize, were now operating inside a different system. A system where history can be treated like inventory. And in Peter's mind, that system isn't just unfair. It's heartbreaking. Because it doesn't just risk unreleased music. It risks the dignity of the person who made it. And that's why this isn't just vault drama. It's a signal. a signal that something inside the legacy machine has shifted, and Peter believes it's shifting fast. When people hear vault, they picture money. They picture a metal door, a code, something locked away because it's valuable. But the alleged story Peter Criss is reacting to isn't about cash value first. It's about personal value. Because in the world of legacy rock, an archive isn't just a storage space. It's a nervous system. It holds the parts of the story that never made it to the stage, and sometimes the parts that explain why the stage looked the way it did. That's why Ace Frehley's vault isn't just unreleased songs to people who understand how this era worked. It's private history. Demos with rough vocals that never got polished. Alternate takes that show who played what. Handwritten notes that reveal intention. Old recordings with studio chatter that captures dynamics in real time. Ideas that were dropped, changed, or reworked. And the important part is this. A vault doesn't only contain what's good. It contains what's true. That's why artists protect it. Because once those materials leave the artist's control, they stop being memories and start becoming assets, items that can be repackaged, interpreted, and framed. And framing is everything in legacy storytelling. Peter reportedly understands that better than most, because he's lived through decades of narratives forming around Kiss. Narratives that often become official simply because they get repeated the most. So when Peter allegedly heard that Ace's archive had been accessed without permission, it didn't register as someone looked at boxes. It registered as something deeper. A boundary had been crossed in a way that changes how safe the past is. Because here's what fans don't always realize. Old material isn't neutral. It can reopen arguments about credit. It can shift perceptions of who contributed what. It can reveal versions of songs before they were edited. It can complicate the clean story people prefer. And when a legacy machine wants a clean story, raw archives are dangerous. That's why Peter reportedly sees a vault like something sacred, not in a religious sense, but in a human one. Sacred as in, this belongs to the person who lived it. Peter has always spoken, at least according to longtime observers, like someone who values acknowledgement and respect more than theatrics. So in his mind, this isn't about protecting secrets. It's about protecting dignity. Because if someone can access Ace's creative history without Ace's permission, Peter reportedly believes it sends a message. Your work isn't yours anymore. Your story isn't yours anymore. Your boundaries don't matter anymore. That's why Peter's reaction, according to sources close to him, wasn't rage. It was fear mixed with clarity. Fear because once boundaries become optional, anything can be justified. And clarity because it explains something he may have felt for a long time. That legacy doesn't always get honored, it gets managed. This is where the story tightens. Peter allegedly didn't just focus on the idea that the vault was accessed. He focused on the timing. Because timing is what turns a mistake into a signal. If this happened during a random moment, you could argue it was confusion, miscommunication, administrative mess. But Peter reportedly believed the timing pointed to intention, not criminal intention, but organizational intention. The kind that shows up when people are planning releases, shaping narratives, preparing content, and treating old history like a pipeline. Again, to stay clear, none of this is presented as proven wrongdoing. It's Peter's reported interpretation of what access means in a legacy environment. But interpretations matter because they shape behavior. And Peter's interpretation was harsh. That the people controlling the story may now feel entitled to the pieces of the story they didn't personally live. That's why he reportedly kept repeating a single idea to those around him. Ace didn't consent. And consent is the moral center of the whole thing. Not law. Not contracts. Not technical ownership. Respect. The respect to ask. The respect to include. The respect to recognize that behind every archive is a person whose memories are attached to those recordings. And Peter allegedly believes that respect is what's disappearing. Which is why, in his mind, this wasn't a minor incident. It was a turning point. A moment that revealed the new rules. The story will be told with or without you. The materials will be used with or without you. The legacy will move forward even if you feel violated by the process. And that's the part that makes this feel heartbreaking rather than just dramatic. Because Peter isn't describing a war over songs. He's describing what happens when trust dies quietly. And once trust dies, everything becomes transactional. That's what Peter reportedly meant when he said, "That's when I knew." But here's the question that takes us into part 3. What exactly did Peter believe this incident proved? Because according to sources, he didn't stop at "it was opened." He allegedly connected it to a bigger realization, one that made him feel like the relationships, the respect, and even the meaning of legacy itself had shifted permanently. And once you hear what he says he knew, you'll understand why he believes this wasn't an accident. It was a warning. Peter Criss didn't describe it like a shocking crime story. According to people close to him, he described it like a realization. The kind of realization you don't arrive at in 1 second. You arrive at after years of watching small things add up, until one last detail makes the whole pattern undeniable. That's why, when Peter reportedly said, "That's when I knew," it wasn't about one lock being opened. It was about what that act symbolized. Because Peter allegedly believes the vault wasn't opened by mistake, in the way fans might imagine. Not necessarily because someone had bad intentions, but because the environment had changed so much that permission stopped being the priority. That's the shift. Permission stopped being sacred. And once that happens, Peter reportedly believes everything becomes negotiable. Not only music, but identity, credit, and narrative. People familiar with Peter say he sees archives as the last line of personal control in a world that tries to package everything. Once a band becomes a legacy machine, your past can be chopped up into documentaries, anniversary releases, boxed sets, official stories. And the scariest part isn't that your history gets used. It's that it gets used in a way you don't recognize. So when Peter heard that Ace's personal archive had been accessed without consent, as he understands it, he reportedly connected it to a deeper fear he's carried for years. That the old relationships aren't being honored as relationships anymore. They're being treated like inventory. Peter has reportedly implied in past comments that there's a difference between celebrating history and controlling history. Celebrating means respecting the people who built it. Controlling means using the pieces you want and ignoring the voices that complicate the story. And from Peter's perspective, this vault incident wasn't about someone being curious. It was about someone feeling entitled. Entitled to open private material. Entitled to decide what gets released. Entitled to shape how the world remembers Ace. That's why, according to sources close to Peter, his immediate reaction wasn't to go public. It was to verify. People close to him claim he asked a series of questions that sounded less like outrage and more like someone trying to understand the scope. Who accessed it? When? Was Ace told? Was Ace asked? Was anyone pretending it was routine? Because the answer to those questions determines whether it's a misunderstanding or a sign of a new rule. And Peter allegedly came to one conclusion. Even if no one intended harm, the fact it could happen at all meant the culture had changed. In a respectful environment, permission is automatic. In a transactional environment, permission becomes optional. Peter reportedly said the part that broke him wasn't even the idea of unreleased music being touched. It was the disrespect of bypassing the person it belonged to. That's why he allegedly framed it as a loyalty issue. Ace isn't just a bandmate from the past. To many fans, Ace is a symbol of a certain authenticity, the raw creativity that helped define the early era. And Peter, according to his supporters, feels protective of that authenticity because he knows how easily official history can become sanitized. So in Peter's mind, if someone can open Ace's vault without consent, they can do something even worse. They can extract pieces that fit the approved narrative and leave out the pieces that don't. That's what made him say, "That's when I knew." Because it wasn't about the vault door. It was about the story door. The door to rewriting, reframing, selecting. And Peter reportedly believes that once that door opens, it never closes. Now, to keep this legally and ethically safe, it's crucial to say clearly, we don't have verified documentation of who accessed what, or under what circumstances. The story here is Peter's reported belief and interpretation, filtered through those close to him, and through how fans have discussed it. But even as belief, It carries emotional weight because it explains something fans have sensed for years. That the legacy machine doesn't always prioritize the people inside the legacy. It prioritizes the product, the timeline, the story that sells. And if the product requires controlling raw materials, vaults, tapes, notes, then those raw materials will be treated like assets, not memories. Peter allegedly sees that as heartbreaking because it reduces human relationships to content pipelines, which is why he reportedly didn't just react with disappointment. He reacted with a deeper kind of certainty, the kind you get when something confirms what you already feared. That respect has become optional, that boundaries are now negotiable, that the old friendships no longer carry the moral weight they used to. And according to sources, Peter said something that captured the emotional core of it all, not as a quote carved in stone, but as a paraphrased sentiment. It's not about the tapes. It's about what it says. That line matters because it sets up the escalation. Because if Peter believes this moment proves that the legacy system is now operating without consent, then the next fear becomes obvious. What happens next? What gets released? What gets edited? What gets framed as official? What gets used to shape public memory? And most of all, what happens if Ace doesn't even get to control his own story? That's where Part 4 lands. The larger fight over legacy, ownership, and dignity, and why Peter believes this isn't just Ace's battle. It's everyone's. If Peter Criss is right about one thing, at least from his perspective, it's that this story isn't really about a vault. It's about what happens when rock history becomes a business model. Because the moment an archive stops being private memories and starts being treated as content, everything changes. The people who live the history become secondary to the people who control the releases. And the public memory begins to favor the version that's officially packaged, not the version that's emotionally true. That's why, according to those close to Peter, the alleged vault access didn't feel like a small incident. It felt like a warning sign. A sign that the legacy machine had crossed into a new phase. One where materials can be handled, reviewed, and prepared without the kind of respect that used to be automatic. Now, to be clear, we're not asserting verified wrongdoing. This is an interpretation of what Peter reportedly believes happened and what it symbolizes. But symbol is exactly what matters here. Because when you're a legacy artist, your story is all you have left to protect. The tours happen. The photos get taken. The interviews fade. The years move fast. What remains is narrative. Who gets credit? Who gets named? Who gets framed as central? Who gets treated like a footnote? And that battle becomes even more intense when unreleased material enters the picture. Why? Because unreleased material can change the story. A demo can suggest different contributions. A rough take can highlight different voices. Notes can reveal who is driving a creative choice. Those are the kinds of details that can threaten a clean public narrative. So the person who controls the vault doesn't just control songs. They control interpretation. That's the heart of Peter's fear. And according to his supporters, that fear isn't paranoid. It's experienced. Because fans have watched legacy narratives get cleaned up for decades. They've watched certain conflicts get minimized. Certain contributions get glossed over. Certain names get repeated until they become the official story. In that context, the vault becomes a battleground. Not because anyone wants drama, but because everyone understands what raw materials can do. They can validate the messy truth. And messy truth is expensive. It's expensive in PR terms. Expensive in brand terms. Expensive in relationships. So brands prefer clean stories. That's why Peter reportedly sees this as a moral issue, not just a technical issue. Because even if contracts exist, even if there are legal interpretations of ownership, Peter's point is simpler. If it's Ace's personal archive, you ask Ace. If Ace isn't asked, then respect is gone. And when respect is gone, legacy becomes extraction. That's the word Peter's supporters keep circling back to, extraction. Taking the parts that can be monetized, packaging the parts that fit the story, leaving behind the parts that complicate it. And if you're Ace, the risk is that you become a character in someone else's documentary, a symbol, a chapter, a brand asset, instead of the author of your own story. According to those close to Peter, This is why Peter sees himself as defending Ace's dignity. Not because Peter is trying to fight the whole organization. Because he believes Ace isn't the type to constantly police every narrative twist. Ace has always been portrayed as someone who prefers distance, who avoids endless public conflict, who chooses calm over constant commentary. And in a world where calm gets interpreted as consent, that becomes dangerous. So Peter allegedly feels a responsibility, not to create a spectacle, but to signal that a boundary exists. A boundary the public might not see. A boundary that says, you can celebrate history, but you can't hijack it. That's the core of the fight. And that's why fans are splitting again. Some fans argue, if the band is one legacy, the archive belongs to the legacy. Others argue, no, personal archives are personal and consent matters. Both views exist, and without verified documentation, the story remains interpretation-heavy. But emotionally, Peter's version hits because it touches a raw truth of aging artists. When you're younger, you fight over future opportunities. When you're older, you fight over the past, because the past is what the world will remember. And nothing feels more heartbreaking than watching someone you respect lose control over how they are remembered. That's why this story resonates beyond Kiss fandom. It's about ownership of identity. It's about who tells the story when the storytellers are tired. It's about what happens when history becomes a product line. And it forces a final, unavoidable question. If Peter believes Ace's vault was opened without permission, what does Peter do now? Does he go public? Does he confront privately? Does he ask Ace to speak? Does he accept that the machine will keep moving? That question leads into the ending, not with an expose, but with Peter's quiet conclusion about trust, loyalty, and the moment he realized the system had changed. Because the tragedy of this story isn't that a vault exists. It's that a friendship may no longer be enough to keep it protected.